was a farmer, an educator, and a governor of the Chickasaw Nation. He served our tribe for nearly 40 years during some of the darkest days of our history, and he is highly revered to this day. Douglas H. Johnston, a treasure among our Chickasaw leaders and legacies.
His father died in the Civil War, and his mother died shortly after that, and so he was orphaned very young.
A tragic loss at a young age may have set Douglas Johnston on a path that would serve him and the Chickasaw Nation in ways he couldn't have imagined when he was a youngster trying to survive.
He lost his parents at about age 9.
I think the fact that Douglas Johnston was an orphan impacted his extended life because he had to be more independent. He had to learn how to be around probably adults at a very early age.
He had a lot of things that he wanted to accomplish in life, and he intended to do just that in his lifetime. He had goals.
And to realize those goals for a more certain future, he had to grow up fast.
He was raised by his half-brother, Tandy C. Walker.
I think in many ways that's important for him, in part because both he and his brother will then decide that education is important in his very young and formative life.
The thing about the Chickasaw people that is so admirable on every level is that they always valued education. I think his first love was education.
He spends time at Chickasaw Manual Labor Academy. He then goes on to Bloomfield from there.
In order for them to have the modern day warriors, or the warriors that would fight with words and fight with education and knowledge, because they understood that knowledge was power.
And I think that's significant because it charts his path later towards becoming superintendent of Bloomfield. And from there, he's going to launch his political career.
The time frame, it really began in 1887 with a senator by the name of Dawes in Congress.
Senator Henry Dawes led the movement to assimilate tribes by breaking up their communally owned landmass, by allotting parcels to individual tribal citizens.
Dawes and senators of his ilk were saying, well, we need the Indians to compete against each other. They shouldn't be holding land in common. They should have to compete against each other because that's the American way.
Certainly the late 1880s are one of the darkest, most threatening times. It's a time when policymakers had made that decision that once and for all, they're going to try to force Native Americans to assimilate.
They could do away with all the tribal governments, which are a thorn in their sides, and we wouldn't have to put up with the Indians anymore.
In the beginning of the allotments being pushed on our people. It was a time of struggle.
The federal government, because of legislation, was going to end the 5 tribes' governments, knowing that Congress, with its plenary power, meaning essentially that heads we win, tails you lose.
The Dawes Act will happen in 1887.
And with it came a tidal wave of inevitable challenge and disruption.
It looked like the Chickasaw Nation as a political entity was teetering on the edge of extinction.
We get slogans at that time, kill the Indian, save the man. And in essence, what they're literally choosing and trying to do is cultural genocide. I can't overstate how critical this time was.
The Chickasaw Nation faced a treacherous future built on broken promises and broken treaties.
They could change any treaty at any time. The most solemn promises and oaths that could be taken were always violated every single time.
And the language in the Atoka Agreement said that we would cease to exercise our governmental powers, that we would lose our judiciary and our legislature first. We would have a governor appointed by the President of the United States, and we would become just a figure of head executive department running the tribe.
If the government's going to do this, it has to break its own treaties.
We were going to be forcefully merged into the larger population. We've never had any problem being part of the United States of America, but we've always wanted to maintain our own separate identity, our own culture, and our own political institutions, all of which predate the existence of the United States of America.
But how do you maintain a separate identity when the federal government is making plans to extinguish your rights as a tribal government?
They knew that the tribal government was going to be dissolved, but in what means, in what manner would it be dissolved, and how could it be the most advantageous to the tribe?
So I think our ability to maintain a very precarious balance between staying Native American, staying tribal, and yet at the same time being part of the larger society is really an underappreciated part of our history.
And so it takes a strong leader to rise up at a time when the federal government is so bent on following this course and literally trying to destroy tribes.
There's nothing that I've seen that indicates that he was really interested in politics early on.
But politics finds him. And once it finds him, he's very natural at it.
He was obviously born into difficult and tumultuous circumstances in the late 19th century. We were being liquidated as a government, as a people. Our identity was going to be destroyed.
Governor Johnston was a Renaissance man in every sense of the word. I think he was sort of regal and had a really focused gaze and countenance.
Douglas Johnston was one of those persons who you could just tell by his bearing and his demeanor that he was a leader. I would compare him very much to today's Bill Anatomy.
He became superintendent at Bloomfield. There was a time when the facility burned, and he had to go work with the Chickasaw legislature pretty closely to get funding to rebuild it. So that's when he really started getting involved in tribal politics.
He got on with virtually everybody. Then he was actually, I believe, approached by some of the elders.
So Governor Johnston makes the decision at that point in time that the future of the nation is in such dire straits at that point in time and facing elimination and literally extermination, and that maybe he has the skills and the leadership that can help them through a very, very dark time. It's like a perfect storm of events. Governor Johnston is choosing to run for office in 1898.
I think Governor Johnston looked on this as my job is to, number one, save as much as I can for my people, and number two, preserve the possibility for them not to be swallowed up, preserve the possibility of them to maintain their identity and their history and go forward. He was a far-seeing and really magnificent leader for our people at a pivotal time. He was the longest-serving governor in our history, but a governor who really, frankly, always put his people first.
Governor Johnston knew early on that the only way we would survive is to work with the government.
Ethan Allen Hitchcock, the Secretary of Interior, and Douglas Johnston just didn't see eye to eye on a lot of things. The people were unhappy because they were having to change their way of life drastically and become landowners.
A lot of people were on Chickasaw land and had no earthly right to be there.
So one of the things that the tribe always had to deal with was people who were fraudulent people getting on the tribal rolls. I referred to them as the court citizens. They didn't have one drop of blood. They may have not even shaken hands with a Chickasaw person. But this is a matter of literally life and death for Chickasaw people because they faced difficult times.
It came at such a hard time because he was kind of holding the tribe together after statehood and trying to do his best to keep us from losing any more.
We're talking decades of trying to get things done and only to be stonewalled by the federal government. When he stepped off the train in Tishomingo, they said that he looked like a cadaver that the buzzards had been feeding on. He was so gaunt and so thin.
When Alfalfa Bill first came, he came penniless. He did not come working for the tribe or Governor Johnston.
But he heard about all this opportunity that was out there for the taking, in a good way, in Indian Territory. So he came to Tishomingo, and he didn't know a soul. He would walk the streets of Tishomingo reading. And goodness help the poor soul that would interrupt him, because he was very colorful in his language.
He saw a light on in Emmett, Oklahoma, that attracted him to it as a moth to a flame.
He was a contemporary of Martin Van Buren Cheadle, who practiced law in the Chickasaw Nation at that time.
I am the great-grandson of Martin Van Buren Cheadle, also known as M.V. Cheadle, who was president of the Senate, who was secretary of the House of Representatives, and he immediately fell in with my grandfather, who was an attorney, and so they formed a partnership, a legal partnership, and that introduced him, of course, to Douglas Johnston.
Alfalfa Bill Murray was brash, hard-nosed, and Douglas Johnston was mild-mannered and methodical.
And they connected. They just connected.
When William Henry David Murray, Alfalfa Bill Murray, was summoned to the White House to speak with him about possibly representing the tribe as their attorney. When asked, well, what are your qualifications? He said, I can write anything from a Constitution to a Bill of Rights, whatever you need, I can do it.
And he said, well, I'm trying to put my school back together, and I've already tried sending these papers, and they sent them back to me saying that these are unreadable. Can you make them readable?
And he said, I will make you this offer. I will submit the documents that you and the Chickasaw people require, and if they are rejected, if they're not satisfactory in any way, you don't owe me a penny.
We know of so many times that Alfalfa Bill not only went to bat as an attorney, but wrote document after document that never came back from Washington again.
And the prose was tight. All the legal points were covered. And it was very well written. And so obviously, Governor was very pleased.
And they were friends from then on. And so they worked well together for the well-being of the Chickasaw Nation.
And they shook hands on it. There wasn't a document that was drawn up. There was nothing except a handshake, because that's the way it was.
One has to ask yourself, why are you building such a stately building and spending $15,000 on a building by $1898 when you're facing a future that doesn't even provide for any room for your existence?
They knew that if they built this Capitol, which was a monument to the Chickasaw people, they probably wouldn't have it for very long. It was kind of symbolic of the strength of the Chickasaw people.
It's a statement that the Chickasaw Nation had made a decision they weren't going away.
And yes, it was probably a difficult time when he had to move out of there. I believe he felt like at some point that the Capitol would revert back to the Chickasaw people. It didn't happen in his lifetime.
We no longer had the Capitol building. We barely had it 10 years. So his office was here. The house was actually built in 1895. Different politicians had been telling him, if you really plan to run like we're asking you to, you must go ahead and build a house proper of a governor. And you must do that before you become governor. So no one can say that this house was built by tribal funds.
And not only is he building a home, he's building this beautiful, stately home that, by all accounts, was probably one of the finest in that part of the frontier.
Day-to-day activities they would just carry out right there.
Obviously, I never knew him, but my grandmother did. And she and Teata used to talk a lot about going to the Chickasaw White House and just the lively social life.
The Chickasaw White House, his home near Emmett, was a mecca for people who enjoyed the arts. Anyone who was anyone in Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory spent time at the White House.
Loved to go there and just walk through it. I just wish that my aunts and my dad could see what the nation has done to preserve that and how much care has been taken in making it exactly the way it was. And it was the hub of activities for the nation socially.
Well, I can tell you that Governor Johnston, the very table that he signed documents, the table remains in this house to this day. And every guest that signs our register uses that very same desk.
He knew what he was doing, he knew his business, he knew what he wanted, and he was able to work the system that the white man created to his advantage. He wasn't just the governor of the Chickasaw Nation. He was also a statesman that worked well with other people because he was actually given opportunity to compromise. He was given power by members of Congress.
And then when the Dawes Act began to basically liquidate the nation.
One of the things that needed to be done was to try and keep the fraudulent people off the tribal rolls.
And Douglas Johnston was the leader in making sure that the land, even if it was passing into individual ownership, would pass to Chickasaws.
But on the part of these so-called court citizens, they were clearly defrauding the tribe. They swore an oath that was fraudulent and perjury from the time they took their hand off the Bible. So, in essence, if you were deemed a Chickasaw citizen, that would mean essentially some $5,000 in total wealth.
Of course, meant the real Chickasaws had less.
It's just a really dark chapter.
One of the things that's invaluable to the Chickasaw Nation, Choctaw Nation, and other nations, he makes a decision that instead of the federal government controlling the enrollment process and controlling citizenship, it should be the tribes themselves and the Chickasaw Nation.
And what they found was a provision in the Atoka Agreement which the Dawes Commission had overlooked. The simple fact that in order for these people to be included on the rolls, it had to be approved by both Chickasaws and the Choctaws.
The Chickasaws were just such tough negotiators, they would not take no for an answer.
So he gets established the citizenship courts. They get to go through and evaluate everybody who's applying for the Dawes rolls.
No other tribe has that distinction during that time period. About 60% of the cases to say you are not a Chickasaw citizen, you have never been a Chickasaw citizen, and they were thrown out.
Through his efforts, they eliminated 4,000 people from those rolls. By all accounts, it saved the Chickasaw Nation $20 million, and that's by 1902 standards.
And this is in the time in our history where that would be likened to billions of dollars.
By the time all these things happened, there had been so much corruption as to the access to those properties and the government charging taxes on homesteads, for example, and things like this that should never have been.
The other thing that probably would be the greatest benefit, when Oklahoma became a state on November 16, 1907, they wished to tax the Chickasaw Nation by virtue of levying a tax against them through the legislature.
The state of Oklahoma now threatened to tax you. So many of them didn't have the means to pay that tax. And if you couldn't pay the tax, it then gave them the right to take their land, which is the intent behind that.
Part of the agreement he helped negotiate was that Chickasaws who held now in individual ownership Chickasaw land would not be taxed by the state of Oklahoma or any government unit of Oklahoma for 21 years. Well, Oklahoma tried to break that agreement, and he took them to the Supreme Court in 1912 and won the case.
And by suing and being successful in court, it sets a precedent for future nations today to have that right to sue the federal government.
I don't know a lot of other tribes that in 1912 were taking the federal government to Supreme Court and winning. And so in that sense, you know, he's a very wise leader. I would compare him to somebody like Churchill in the dark days of the Second World War. So he was wily in using the laws, and he was a very skillful negotiator, a very effective advocate for us in Washington, D.C., when frankly, a period of time when the government was effectively trying to terminate Indian tribes and look past their rights.
The getting us from here to here and all the between, and it sounds so easy, but it was not at all. There were so many hills to climb.
And it's just a sad, sad commentary on what was going on throughout Indian Territory.
I can't think of something higher to do in this life than to take care of the Chickasaw Nation, all of us as citizens. And that's what he did for nearly 40 years.
Because in some of the dealings with the liquidation of the tribal affairs, the federal government just strung him along and tried to get him to just give up and throw his hands up and take any deal that was offered.
You can only imagine that he felt overwhelmed.
But he kept persisting. He was resilient. And so he was able to mingle the various constituencies and the people in the positions of power.
There were times that he wouldn't get paid for months and months on end. A lot of times he would have to use his own money to finance the activities of his governorship. But whenever he wanted money to help the Chickasaw people, it was like pulling teeth. This was Chickasaw money, and yet the federal government was real hesitant to release it for projects that the governor requested them for.
The aim was just to keep alive, just to survive and wait till time and chance turned in our direction. So again, in every way, politically, in terms of our property, in terms of our culture, he did the things that were necessary to make sure that we survived what was probably the darkest period of our nation's history. I think Governor Johnston's greatest accomplishment was ensuring Chickasaw survival as a political and a cultural unit during a period in which the larger society around it was trying to delegitimize it both politically and culturally. And to sit down and negotiate and walk away with deals that, again, protected our property, served our people, established the idea that we would still be a political entity.
He later becomes part of a long line of Chickasaw leadership, governors who see the future of the Chickasaw Nation through education.
The education was something that he had a very earnest interest in. The education of all children, not just his, but all Chickasaw children. And that's exactly what he did until his deathbed. He fought for the education of all of our children.
At times when it would have been very easy for him to just concede, he's up against the fight of his life, he's facing the grimmest of all challenges. Like other individuals did elsewhere, they finally gave up and saw it as a lost cause. He does not.
When he passed away, his death is a part of our congressional record. There was a moment of silence, and essentially the nation's capital of the United States of America stopped to honor this great Chickasaw statesman.
This is a 40-year-long governor. A governor, if Teddy Roosevelt had his way, would have served in 1906 and 1907, the nation would have been dissolved, and that would have been the end of the Chickasaw Nation. But he serves right up to his death.
He was still on his deathbed negotiating for the Chickasaw people.
Governor Murray actually delivered the eulogy for Governor Johnston when he died in 1939.
And one of the things that strikes me in that eulogy is he literally said about his close friend, meaning Governor Johnston, he said that he was nearly a perfect man.
He's just a figure that is almost larger than life. I can almost feel like I've met him. I've studied his life so extensively, and it's been such a blessing for me to get to do that.
Melvin Cornish says, if you judge him by his accomplishments, he may be the greatest American Indian who's ever lived. Somewhere, if Governor Johnston can look down upon the Chickasaw Nation, he must be smiling. He must be exceptionally proud.
At a time when it appears that nation is going to be erased from history and terminated in a way that could never come back, and yet he kept the spirit alive. He may have been the only man at the right time.
He was generous to a fault, and that's why he died essentially penniless. And he was always battling to help his people. But he wasn't embittered by the experience.
And those very politicians who are trying to destroy him and his people, he reaches out and he finds a way of compromising and he finds a way of negotiating. When he dies in 1939, those same politicians from the floor pass a resolution to honor Governor Johnston. It takes great skill and navigation to work with the Dawes Commission, to work with Teddy Roosevelt, to work with others whose full intent is to legislate you out of existence.
And that's the unconquered and unconquerable spirit that Chickasaw Nation has today.
He's like a giant to me, and it is such a testament to his character that he didn't become embittered, he didn't become turned inward and feel like he's a victim. And he deserves to be recognized historically, and that was one of the main motivations that I had for wanting to tell his story, and it's what a blessing it's been to tell his story.
I would definitely say that Governor Johnston was the right man at the right time for the Chickasaw Nation. He didn't represent a family, a person. He represented the Chickasaw Nation, and that's what he fought for.
I often think if he and his peers of that period could come back today and see where the Chickasaw Nation is at, they would be very proud of their people.
I believe that Governor Johnston, seeing what he would see of the Chickasaw Nation today, I think he'd be so proud.
I think he would be proud.
And that our young ones understand how proud they should be to be able to say, I am Chickasaw. I am Chickasaw. I live in the Chickasaw Nation. I am from the Chickasaw Nation.
What's the importance of talking about them? Not just to honor them. Of course we want to honor them and remember them, but to learn the lessons. And the lessons of perseverance, the lessons of determination, the lessons of doing the honorable thing. We have opportunities for education and employment that Chickasaws 20 and 30 years ago couldn't dream of. But all that comes because somebody kept us together as a people. And sometimes the good Lord gives you the right person at the right time. He blessed the Chickasaw Nation by giving us Douglas Johnston at that particular perilous moment in our history.
But because of him, and this is his greatest contribution, the nation is still here, and the nation is still going, and the nation's still strong.
Governor Johnston never gave up. He was unconquered, even though we were going through such hard times. He persevered. He would feel the great Chickasaw pride and that we are still surviving.
I would just tell him, Governor Johnston, you will never understand how you provided the foundation for the nation we are today. And it was on your back, and that the principles that you handed down, that we've achieved what we have. We owe you a debt that can never be repaid.
We are still unconquered, and we will never be conquered.